Jeg kom på operasjonspresident, men det du forberedt på. Gå ut ifra. Have 1 more minute, so I'll let the latecomers come before we start. Okay, I think we'll start then. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Great to see so many of you here. Please come in. I started a few seconds early, so it's no embarrassment coming in now. Not at all. So my name is Karsten Friis. I'll be moderating this fantastic panel we have today. We're going to discuss transatlantic relations. The backdrop of course, is the upcoming NATO summit, but of course, it's also the more troubling long-term issues regarding how is the relationship between Europe and United States. I like to also, you can continue the discussions on social media, so that the NUPI will be tweeting this event on the hashtag NUPINit. So you're welcome to engage in that debate. The debate is also streamed live, so everything we say will be on record forever. So that's how it is. So Trump presidency, we have seen he's pulling out of Paris, Iran, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, tariffs and trade war, the recent G7 meeting that didn't go too well, and of course ongoing criticism of Europe not spending enough money and actually owing United States money. It's not a very rosy picture when the leader of North Korea is described in more rosy words than the Prime Minister of Canada. So it's a bit challenging, especially because Europe is so dependent upon the United States when it comes to our defense. We're completely dependent when it comes to at least conventional, traditional defense. So the question is this a situation that is the new normal, or is it just something that has to blow over? It will blow over. So we have kind of two questions there. It's a short-term one, right? What will happen? How will we cope through the summit, which is coming up in a few weeks' time? What will Trump say or not say? How can we avoid that kind of G7, or what happened in the last summit, or which wasn't a summit but a meeting in Brussels last year, which was not very successful? How can we avoid that situation happening again? But in the long term, is this just Trump, or is it something that's going to blow over? We can wait it out, or is it something deeper here that we have to prepare for and have a kind of a plan B in Europe, as it were, and build what Europe calls strategic autonomy? The format of this discussion is 1 hour. I invited all the speakers to have introduced like 5 to 7 minutes, I said, each. Then I will follow up with some comments, and they can comment on each other. After that, I will ask some questions, and then, of course, towards the end, we will also open for some Q&A from the audience. Let me introduce the audience. Sorry, the panel. It took a bit too long to introduce you all, right? Starting up there. You know the Minister of Foreign Affairs, of course, Ian Eriksson Søreide, former Minister of Defense as well, and former chairperson of the Standing Committee of Foreign and Defense Issues in the Parliament. You know also our Minister of Defense, who used to be also Europe Minister, and also member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly when you were MP in Norwegian Parliament. Now, the other speakers, you don't know that well, so I'll read a little bit here because they are fantastic CVs and it's very interesting. So, Ambassador Doug Lute used to be United States ambassador to NATO. He was from 2013 to 2017. And you are also, besides being a retired ambassador, you're also basically a career military, a retired lieutenant general. But you served 6 years in the White House, coordinating the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then you have served several places in the military. Director of JHC, Joint Staff, and Europe Cent Command. You also served here in Europe during a period. You also have education from West Point and Kennedy Harvard School. Fantastic CV. And then last but not least, if you saw the invitation, we had invited Constanze Stelzenmüller. Those who know Constanze will see that this is not Constanze. Unfortunately, she got ill yesterday, actually. But then our good friend Barbara Kunz from Paris, our sister organization, a NUPI sister organization, was very sporty to say, I will come because I plan to watch this online anyway. So she jumped on the plane last night and came this morning. So fantastic. Barbara, you have a PhD from University of Stockholm. You work, as I said, in IFRI, which is the Institut Français Relationnel International, NUPI in French. Right? Your specialty is German-French Defense Cooperation, European defense, NATO, and Nordic Baltic as well, of course, from your experience from living and working in Sweden. You also, of course, worked in Germany with different think tanks, and also you had been at the Johns Hopkins at Washington, D.C. in a period. So, welcome to all of you. We'll kick off with the Foreign Minister first, then followed by the Defense Minister, and then with Douglas, and then with Barbara. So please, the floor is yours, and I will be watching you on time here.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction and also the invitation. I think I will skip a couple of points and more or less cut right to the chase on what I think is important that we discuss during this hour. Allied unity and cohesion has always been one of Norway's kind of top priorities, because without that unity, without that cohesion, I don't think it's possible that we have a strong and relevant alliance, not a strong and relevant political alliance or a military alliance. So that's why that point is so important to us. And what's underpinning that kind of unity and that cohesion is something that I feel very strongly about, because I think we are sometimes missing the point when we're not talking about the values that bind us together. We don't talk about values when it comes to Europe, to the WTO, and so forth. We're very technical in our approach. So the values that bind us together is the fact that we are ultimately willing to risk our soldiers' lives to defend each other. And that's a very strong testament in a way. That's what's binding us together, not command structures or standing naval maritime forces, even though they are also important. So I think that in this day and age, that optimism that we had after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we saw that, or we thought that democracy, rule of law, economic growth, that was in a way inherent in all countries, and we followed a very clear path. Now we see that those days are probably behind us, and we see an increased tension among many countries. So we have been adapting the alliance, and we've been doing quite a lot of work since 2014, as Doug also can subscribe to. We've created new defense plans, we have started new investments, and so forth. There is, I think, for Norway also, we are very happy that there is now an increased understanding of the security challenges that we face in the north. Not to say that other challenges are less important, but we have in a way come back to the places we were some decades ago in the understanding of what the North actually entails for our common collective security. And as Karsten mentioned, Allied reinforcements from the US to Europe is kind of crucial for all countries, and that's why this is so important. We have been focusing on a couple of issues for the past 4 years, and one of them being a renewed command structure. And as Doug knows, the first time I raised this issue at a ministerial dinner in 2014, I can tell you that the mood was not exactly, they were not jumping from their seats, to put it mildly.
You called for more wine.
Yeah, that's right.
I remember.
Yeah, and it came actually also, so that's very good. But the point is that unless we're able to also touch upon some of these more difficult issues that will always be difficult in an alliance, we will not be able to adapt accordingly. For instance, to have a command structure now can do larger operations. But all of this is to say that the job is not done. We continue to focus on the 2% target. We continue to focus on burden sharing. We have turned around in Europe. I mean, from Norway's perspective, the fact that we have increased our defense spending with 24% in real terms since 2013 is quite an undertaking. But we still have work to do. The fact that we're investing in new submarines, new F-35s, new intelligence capabilities, army assets, and new P-8s, it's not only because of our own security, it's because of our allied security. That's why we do it. It's an investment in NATO. The same thing when we're hosting the Trident Juncture this fall. Of course, it's nice for Norway, but it's first and foremost nice for the alliance, and it's good for the alliance. I think that one of the interesting discussions that we meet in Europe sometimes is the discussion on how Europe needs to do more for our own security. And I think that's a very valid and very good point. But I think we have to broaden the scope a bit, because this is actually about what we do for our common security. It's not about US or Europe or Norway or Denmark. We have to engage more in each other's security. And I think one of the interesting things, and kind of as important as the engage more in Europe security, is what we do for each other. Because the core principle, the core idea of the transatlantic bond and the transatlantic link is that our security is intertwined. And I think that what is important when we now face a very different security policy outlook is to understand the very, I think, important but sometimes difficult point that we take on obligations that go beyond our own national interests. That's the point of this alliance. And coming back to the point of what the values and everything that kind of binds us together. So, one other point that we talk a lot about is American leadership. And I think that we cannot simply just call for American leadership and I mean, that will lead us nowhere. We have to assume that leadership ourselves as well. It's about political commitment, it's about funding, and it's about the whole range of issues. But we cannot live in denial, because I think that this summit will be in a mood where there are a lot of issues that will overshadow some of the summit issues. JCPOA, trade, and other issues. I mean, look at the G7 summit, and you could see easily that this will not be an easy summer, to put it mildly. But I think that what we need to stay focused on is that despite the differences on trade, on international agreements, we share some very real security challenges, and that should be our focus. And just lastly, mentioning that political cohesion is actually key to NATO's success. Every one of us in this room knows that NATO has been faced with severe challenges again and again and again, but has always proven solidity to solve these issues. I think we have to be prepared for something that we haven't done much of or been prepared for over the past years, and that is actually allied patience. We have to see beyond the immediate strains on the transatlantic bond, on allies being not always in unity and not always agreeing. We have to realize that there will be value-based tensions. We have to realize that we will give and receive criticism. But I think the essence of that solidity in NATO is the fact that we are united by values, we are united by interests, and both of them run deeper than the disagreements of today. So with those words, I am at least a bit hopeful that we will have a good summit in July. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Line. So Frank, if I may, on the
Thank
first
you.
name, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, as Ine mentioned, Norway has been a staunch member of the NATO alliance since its inception in 1949. I've tried to follow the public debate in Norway, and I noticed that someone is surprised that this means both being a member of an alliance and having allied. But it comes with both. to be a member, you also have allied. The Second World War clearly showed that we cannot ensure our independence and sovereignty alone. The most important aim for NATO summit is, as Sine said, allied unity, and I think we need to stress this and discuss this every time we meet. While individual allies have their differences, we all agree on the need to strengthen the security and stability of all allies. And we have come a long way since Warsaw. But towards the summit and beyond, further strengthening of deterrence and defense must be our first priority. Norwegian security policy is closely tied to our geographic location. That's also a point that seems to surprise some Norwegians sometimes. The High North is of great strategic importance for us. We manage large ocean areas containing enormous resources, while at the same time the Russian Kola Peninsula is just across the border from Norway. The peninsula is home to the Russian strategic deterrent. They base the defense on these assets on the so-called bastion defense concept, which has capabilities of anti-access area denial in the North Atlantic. However, it is important to note that the High North is a region of relative stability. We do not see Russia as a direct military threat against Norway today. But even so, the challenges from the East are the key driving factor in NATO's renewed priority of collective defense and deterrence. In the High North, we are cooperating with our allies to gain situational awareness. However, in the areas closest to Russia, we take most of the responsibility. We do this because our presence is known. A Norwegian plane, Norwegian ship is a predictable sign. And by taking this responsibility, we avoid misunderstandings. That's the reason why we are buying new equipment, F-35, P-8, maritime patrol, new submarines. Norway like to be present in the north because we are a known neighbor and we are a predictable, stable neighbor. Another aspect of collective defense and unity within the alliance is burden sharing. As you know, it is an important element in the transatlantic dialogue towards the summit. Norway stays committed to moving towards the 2% goal. How we will achieve this is a key aspect in the next long-term defense plan, with effect from 2021. And this is an important point because we are working on 4 years long-term plans. This is important because we like to modernize the defense. Just to spend more money will lift us on the statistics, but it won't help us create better defense. So we're sticking to the plan, and the next long-term plan would be clear on how to move towards the 2% goal and building better defense, more modern defense. This is the backbone of the alliance ability, credibility, and efficiency. I look forward to the summit where we will work to improve the command structure. This is important. Securing the sea lines of communication between the US and Europe is vital. The establishment of a new joint force command in Norfolk with the North Atlantic as its primary responsibility is therefore key and most welcome. A command structure also requires trained and available forces. So the US Project 430s initiative to increase the readiness of NATO forces is an important step in the right direction. We applaud that. This aligns with the thinking in our current long-term defense plan, how to be ready earlier. We aim to increase the number of assets available while increasing their readiness. This is accomplished by increased funding for training, maintenance, and stockpiles. And a key element, as I said, this is a key element in our current long-term defense plan. Since Warsaw, new threat vectors have emerged. The cyber domain gives us new opportunities and new vulnerabilities. This can be coupled with disinformation and other hybrid threats to destabilize countries and alliance. The cyber defense pledge from Warsaw aims to counter these potential threats. Norway is participating in the Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Finland. And I think this will also be an important part of the next long-term plan. Cyber as a new domain and hybrid as a new threat. And it implicates military institutions, but it also stretches long way into civil institutions. And that's the complex picture we are looking at. So while we have come a long way since Warsaw, there is still work to be done. I do look forward to the summit, as I said, to the opportunity to discuss the measures we have already taken and to agree with our allies the way forward. And to continue to further adapt and strengthen the alliance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. So I'll pass it on to you, Dag.
Great,
So
thanks.
critical remarks, maybe?
Pardon?
Some critical remarks, perhaps, but less optimistic,
We'll
maybe?
save that for the questions.
Yeah.
So first, it's nice to be back in Oslo, back in Norway with friends and old colleagues. And as an American, it's especially nice to be invited while you're still inviting Americans to come to Norway. So take full advantage of this invitation. I thought I'd focus a little bit on what I think are the 5 key challenges that face the alliance as we go into the summit in 1 month's time. And then give you a little impression about the American contribution towards those challenges. So first of all, I very much echo what the 2 ministers have said as to the summit and the most important thing we can deliver at the summit. There's really only one deliverable, and that's NATO solidarity. That's it. Everything else is commentary. Everything else is down in the tactics. If you follow NATO very closely, like the 5 of us do, you'll track that with great interest. But the big deliverable is cohesion and solidarity. And I think there are 5 challenges to that solidarity today. One is mass migration. Now, that may sound a little unusual in a conversation about NATO, but it's really mass migration into the European continent that challenges governments today. And if there's one issue from an American perspective that we observe that can bring down a European government or change the context of a European government, it's mass migration. So I think that's very important. It's mass migration, after all, that fuels this move towards populism in Europe, and by the way, in my country as well, and also this notion of illiberal democracy. So I put mass migration up on top. It's not going away. The demographics, the economies that have driven mass migration over the last several years are just as present today and going forward. Number 2, terrorism. You know, we like to claim the defeat of ISIS, the caliphate, the physical caliphate in Syria and Iraq. And while it's true that the physical territory that they control has been greatly diminished, ISIS has not gone away. Thousands of European passport holders migrated to that fight. Most of them survived the fight. And many of them, and even if only a small portion, say 10% of them, come back with those battlefield credentials, then we've got an in-house local terrorist challenge that we have to account for. I hope that doesn't play out during the World Cup, but I think Russia has a severe internal security challenge trying to secure the multiple venues of the World Cup, which just kicks off today, right? But over the next month, we're going to see what it means to try to contend with that internal terrorism, counterterrorism problem. Number 3, Russia itself. But here I'm not so worried about nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence. NATO knows how to deal with those. It's really, as the Minister of Defense mentioned, these sub-conventional or sub-Article 5 challenges, hybrid warfare, cyber challenges, interference in our election processes, misinformation campaigns, these things that are ambiguous, covert, below Article 5. Article 5, of course, is the Collective Defense Clause, right? These are the challenges that we face today. And my country saw this firsthand during the 2016 election season, when we know that Russia tried to interfere with the election process, tried to corrupt our voter registration databases, and so forth. And I believe they'll be back at it again during this year's 2018 off-season elections, as we say. So the Russia challenge is different than it was in the Cold War, but it's still there. Number 4, and maybe this is the most troubling here, I echo in particular Minister Saraida's comments, the erosion of values. You know, if you reread the Washington Treaty, the second sentence, the preamble, so before you get to Article 5, allies signed up for the complete treaty, and in the second sentence, it says that all allies agree on the importance of 3 key values: democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Well, if you look at the 29 democracies in the alliance today, you'd have to ask, how are we doing? If you held up a mirror to NATO inside the council room, how are we doing against those three values? I would argue that America has some introspection to do with regard to those 3 values, but not America alone. You know, there's a very interesting product produced regularly by Freedom House, which rates the democracies across Europe with regard to values. And I will tell you the trend lines are like that over the last 10 years. So I think that these values, which are really the bedrock of the alliance, as the minister said, these are the things the alliance was founded on, right? That those have slipped. Those have eroded over time. And then the fifth challenge, I think, quite frankly, are the challenges from the Trump administration itself. And here, obviously, the rhetoric, the words are very disruptive. I think some of the rhetoric coming out of this, and obviously I'm not part of the Trump administration, have been not only disruptive, but have caused an erosion of confidence inside the alliance. What used to be taken as certain, the pledge to Article 5, for example, has been in question. And this erosion of confidence is coupled to an unpredictability. Does anybody here really know what's going to happen in 1 month's time at the NATO summit? No. And that represents a lack of predictability, a lack of confidence in the alliance, which is corrosive and not helpful at all. Now, the good news is that while words can be damaging, actions still in this world speak louder than words. So actions speak louder than words. And here are some of the actions that back up the U.S. commitment to the alliance, despite the words, right? So first of all, our Congress has appropriated over $5 billion a year dedicated to improving deterrence in Europe. It's called the European Deterrence Initiative, EDI, and it's money earmarked for investments in Europe to improve deterrence in Europe. Second of all, we lead one of the 4 NATO battalions on the northeastern flank of the alliance. So we have responsibility for the one in Poland. Beyond that battalion, which flies a NATO flag, is a U.S. armored brigade, home-based in the United States, that rotates into Central and Eastern Europe on a 9-month basis and then is replaced by a successor. So we've got a battalion forward on a regular basis, a rotational brigade backing it up. With the rotational armored brigade comes a brigade of aviation, of helicopters. So we've made quite a heavy investment in the conventional deterrence of the alliance, which was kicked off at Wales and Warsaw, as others have mentioned. We've upped the ante in terms of our exercise program. There's a large sort of 40,000 troop exercise going on now in the Baltics, and called Saber Strike, led by the U.S., and our exercise program on the ground, but also at sea and in the air, has improved. And then finally, gets very little notice, but we've continued to build NATO's second ballistic missile defense site. The first one is operational today in Romania, and the second will be opened in Poland later this year. So if you look at the actions beyond the rhetoric, you actually see a sizable and continuous investment spanning across the last 2 administrations. So I think there's some reassurance here that actions speak louder than words. Now look, we can take on in the course of the questions and answers more specific things, but I go into this summit. We were present at the last 2 summits, Wales and Warsaw. You know, if you're on the staff, summits are a big deal, and they're anxiety producing. Well, I'm not on the staff this time, and I'm more anxious, okay, about this summit. And we can take that on during the questions.
Thank you so much, Doug. So, Barbara, I think Angela Merkel said something about Europe has to start preparing, you know, to protect itself, or something along those lines. What can Europe do? Or what is the European response to all this?
What's the European response? Well, thank you. I think as a think tanker, I'll just ask 3 questions here instead of providing so many answers. And to me, these are the 3 questions that in a way structure the current European security debate. And the first of these questions obviously is, do we need a plan B, given the current state of transatlantic relationships? Or, I mean, you can ask how long will we manage to avoid spillover from disagreements in other fields into defense. And against a plan B, you can, of course, have all the arguments that we've just heard about, the EDI and so on. But I guess the key question here is, of course, is there structural change underway? Is Trump structural in a way? I mean, is there structural change within the United States? Is there structural change going on in the transatlantic relationship? And I mean, we for sure know that there's structural change going on in the international system. So I mean, this is the big picture, but talking about it somehow remains a taboo. And right now, the efforts are mainly directed at keeping the Americans in. But whether that works or not, that's an answer that will ultimately be provided in Washington and not here in Europe. And it would, of course, be smart to start thinking about this before we sort of get a negative answer from the United States. And just finally, also on that first question is, it's of course important to keep in mind that this need not necessarily be black or white. It can also be a matter of degrees. And I mean, these degrees, that in other words is the debate on burden sharing. So this is why this is so important. But I guess pertaining to Plan B, there is also a second question, which in a way is much more intricate and also has much more power even than this first question, the potential to divide Europeans. And that is the question, what do we need a Plan B for? And the answer is not as self-evident as you perhaps might think, because that question, if you translate it into a defense dimension, this is the old East versus South debate, which in defense terms is a debate about collective defense or crisis management. Now, maybe seen from Northern Europe, the answer here is clear, but if you check all of Europe and all the different positions into account, the answer is much more less self-evident. Now, obviously, it doesn't make a lot of sense to ask these questions in terms of either or. It's not either collective defense or crisis management, that's for sure. I mean, what we need is the 360 degrees approach, as it is called within NATO, so it's the East, the South, and the North. But since we have scarce resources in single sets of forces, I guess even nuances and different degrees of priorities in the answers provided to the questions territorial defense or crisis management actually matter. And if you look at Europe, it is very clear that the priorities in responding to that questions are very difficult. Here again, as a final remark on this question, since we don't have too much time to go into details, I think it's also very relevant to keep in mind that the current buzzword that we're discussing a lot on the continent, perhaps more than here, European strategic autonomy, does in its purest sense does not even contain a collective defense dimension, because it was born in an EU context. So automatically, so to say, it is almost exclusively about crisis management with some spillovers due to current developments. That brings me to my third question, and that is, who provides leadership in all these debates that we need to have, should be having, and to some extent are having? And I think if you look at the very big picture questions, the ones I've been asking here, the answer is rather depressing, because I would say there's not really much leadership on it. It's not really addressed. What you can see is what you may label islands of leadership that pertain to, well, some of the aspects that need to be addressed. And you could mention the European Commission, for instance, with the European Defence Fund, but perhaps even more importantly, you could name France with its European Intervention Initiative. How that works out remains to be seen. But I mean, that's an island of leadership within this larger picture. Germany, a year ago, probably everybody was waiting for German leadership. Today, there's probably still some waiting for Germany, but Germany is largely absent from that debate. Some in Paris would go much farther than just saying absent. Some probably would even think that there's a destructive note in it. But expectations on Germany are high, not only from Washington, D.C., and that's, of course, rightly so. Is Germany up to the task? Not really sure, and I think Germany is probably the country within this whole context that is in the most complicated position, both domestically, but also in terms of rethinking security. What we would need probably in this context is a Franco-German leadership, which we don't see, and that's a problem, not only because it's such a nice tradition to have Franco-German leadership, but because going back to question 2, I think Germany really would have the power to balance this debate on collective defense versus crisis management, being much closer to what you may label a majority approach, a majority position within Europe on that. So there is really some need for things to happen in Europe. And of course, I guess there will be a key role, or there should be a key role for Germany, but there's obviously also a key role for everybody else here on this continent. There's a responsibility for all Europeans to think about this and to ensure, three things, and I'll end on that. First of all is to really start thinking about a plan B. Second, to ensure that all steps taken are coherent, which also, and very importantly, includes EU and NATO cooperation. And then finally, to connect these islands of leadership, which of course is closely linked to ensuring cohesion between steps taken. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. So we had the optimistic view of the ministers, and of course the more shadows on the horizon described by the 2 other panelists, a little bit as expected, I guess.
I think we were quite sober.
Yeah. I would like to start with you. Dag mentioned that action speaks louder than words, and I heard you make the same argument many times. That one thing is what the Trump administration, White House is saying, but looks what they're really doing. And that kind of makes sense, but at the same time, does it matter really if you look at, for instance, what happened in Korea now with Trump suddenly cancel exercises without informing the Pentagon? There is doesn't help to have the best military structure in place in the world if we don't agree when to use it or how to use it, or there are sudden surprises. So does this concern you?
Well, I think it's fair to say that what we have experienced so far under the new administration is, if anything, just an increased interest in our close areas, for instance, in the north, and the idea and the interest in engaging even more and investing more and being part of more exercises, and we've seen that there is a real interest also in our assessments of especially Russia because of our long-standing history of neighboring Russia, and as Frank rightly mentioned, geography is maybe the one parameter we cannot escape. So we have to deal with it, and the fact that we have over so many years, also when other countries started to kind of build down their competencies on Russia, we kept it up for obvious reasons, because we need to. We're a neighbor. So we experienced an increased interest and also exploring new areas to cooperate. I mean, our military-to-military cooperation, and especially on intelligence exercises and so forth, has been really very strong for decades. And that's why I've been advocating that in order to not be driven by kind of reading a Twitter account all the time, you have to look at the actual deeds. And when it comes to that, I think we are in a good place. But that's not to say that things like the ones we saw on the Korean Peninsula and the discussions in Singapore could kind of cast a lot of doubt into it, obviously. And I think for all allies, I mean, as I said, we have to be honest about where we are at the moment. But so far, we don't see anything that should make us worried that for our sake, the engagement is going down. And as Doug rightly mentioned, the EDI has, if anything, just increased in size and scope, which of course is a testament to the engagement in European security. So, but of course, the signals are mixed, and that's why we need some help to interpret them. And that's not the only reason Doug is here, but of course one of the reasons. But my point is that we have to, when we are dealing with a very shifting security policy landscape and political landscape in general, we just sometimes have to set our foot on the ground and really stand still for a moment and try to not focus on all the fuss around us and focus on the concrete things and the concrete deliverables. Otherwise, I think we'll lose our focus. It's difficult, but that's what we have to do.
Thank you. Maybe follow up on Dag on this question. If you were to advise European leaders when it comes to dealing with President Trump, should kind of duck and cover and sit and wait till it blows over, or should we engage actively to try to persuade him that we are good allies, or are there other advice you would give?
Well, so as a guy who grew up in the Cold War, duck and cover, of course, has a special meaning, because we were taught as young school kids in, sort of nuclear drills that you got beneath your desk, and somehow that was supposed to protect you. As kids, we never believed it, okay? But it seemed to reassure the adults. So we were very obedient, and we went beneath our desks. It never made any sense. No, look, I don't think we need to duck and cover, and I also don't think we need a plan B. And here's why. We have to distinguish between alliance commitments, which are treaty commitments, which are ratified by the US Senate, and are legally binding commitments. They're not executive agreements, right? So we have to set those aside. So the alliance between the United States and South Korea is not at risk, despite the activities of the last 7 days. The alliance commitments between the United States and its NATO allies are not at risk. Those are ratified by the Senate. And if you want to know how the U.S. Congress views the alliance, then you can look at things like the appropriations of these dollars for the European Defense Initiative, and you can look at things like the provisions that the U.S. Senate took to ensure that the administration, the executive branch, doesn't relent on sanctions towards Russia, which was, I think, passed 98-2 or something like that, and there were 2 senators who were ill that day in the U.S. Senate. So there's a difference here between binding legal commitments and executive agreements. Now, what this administration has done it has reversed executive decisions of the last administration with its own executive decisions. So the Paris Climate Accord was an executive decision. It was not, an executive agreement was not a treaty. Okay, it was not ratified by the Congress. Likewise with the Iran deal, right? And likewise with trade tariffs. Those are executive presidential decisions not ratified by the Congress. So there's a bit of a distinction here, a sharp line that we have to make between what the president's authorities are and where the other institutions of the U.S. government kick in and confine him. And I think that's a pretty sharp change. So we're not into duck and cover. We're into pay attention, okay? We're into do what NATO ought to be doing internally. And some of the steps that Mr. Defense mentioned are absolutely on the mark. NATO should be into doing its business and paying attention. A touch of patience here will serve the alliance very well. But we should distinguish between sort of executive powers and institutional obligations.
So there's hope, yes. Frank, you talked about the burden sharing, 2%. You have to be asked about the 2%. It is one issue that is a bit complicated for Norway because we don't reach the 2% target. And we know that Trump focuses a lot on that. That is what he talks about, what he talked about last year. As you said, we have increased the defense budget significantly over the last 2 years, but as it looks now, our GDP grows faster than our defense budget, so it's difficult to even get closer to the 2%. The critics would say that. The critics say that that makes us, on the one hand, if you political left will say that it makes us more dependent on the United States and NATO. That is not bad, and the criticism from the kind of pro-defense right is that we need a stronger military. So my question is really what do you explain to Trump and your Secretary Mattis? What's the narrative? How do you explain that Norway, such a rich country, not managed to reach the 2% faster?
Well, as you say, GDP is a moving target, so it's difficult, and we get new prognosis every third month, and then the claims from US is that show us a plan. That's actually what they have said. show us a plan. And we have this long-term plan, and then we have said we're starting to work on the next long-term plan, which will reach from 21 till 24. We need to show that we are moving towards the 2% target with that plan. But at the same time, we decided in Wales that at least 20% of the budget should be investments to renew the defense for the allied countries. This is to modernize the defense. It's an important target. We are way beyond that. And which capabilities and which operations do we participate in is also a part of the discussions. And then the 2% target is an easy target both for the president but also for journalists and politicians. So you could point out some easy remarks on that. But we're working on the present long-term plan, and we're doing great progress, increasing the budgets every year, 35% since 2013, using a lot of money. And there are two things which is important. It's to have a good plan and to stick to the plan.
As an academic, I completely agree with you that the 2% is kind of a strange measure, because you measure what you put into it, you don't measure what you get out of it. Yep. But that's nonetheless the reality we live in, that we're focusing on. So if I understand you correctly, you are now indicating that in the next long-term plan there will be new initiatives to increase the budget.
Yeah, of course.
All right.
So
thank you.
Could I just come in
of
on
course.
this? It's important, we have reduced this to a bumper sticker, 2%. It's a little sticker in the back of your car, right? As though that tells the whole story. And it's really useful to go back to the 2014 agreement. So this was done before Trump, by the way. This was done by the Obama administration and allies at that time at the Wales summit. And it's a 10-year program. So what they agreed in 2014 was that by 2024, they would move towards 2%. So any claim that, why aren't you at 2% today is a little out of depth, right? I have to read what was agreed. And then also to the minister's point, we also agreed that as you increase defense spending, we would commit 20% of your defense budget to capital investment. So things like the items, the technology that Norway's buying. So the F-35, the P-8 patrol plane, submarines, and so forth, right? So there's a 2% pledge and there's a 20% pledge. So we need to sort of go back and read what was actually agreed. And there was no demand to get to 2% tomorrow. It was a deliberate plan, and I think Norway's on track to do that.
But still, can I this move towards, it's a kind of political talk, isn't it? Kind of it's kind of, to escape it, right? Because then you can basically spend as long time as you want, right? There is this, the question is are you really committed to increase substantially and recognize there's a new security, it's a new security situation in Europe, and we have to respond to that.
But just to add to what Doug said, because I think that one has to remember where we came from. We came from a period of declining defense budgets in almost all of Europe. So the first thing that was decided in Wales was to turn the trend around, to start the increase. And in itself at that time was actually just a major achievement to get all allies on board on the thought that we have to do something to turn this ship around. And as everyone knows, when you invest in something today, it can take 10 years from now until you have the new equipment and until you can make it operational. And I think that if there is anything I would look out for in the years to come, in addition to the 2% target, I think that there are some issues also on investments in many countries. If you only look at the table of which countries are approaching or are far away from the 2% target, that's one thing. But read also the column about the investments, because there are some countries who are currently quite high on the closing in on the 2% target, but they do nothing to renew their defense capabilities, which means that what they're doing right now is quite short-lived because they're not able to sustain it over time. So unless you start doing the investments now, and I think we will be in 2 or 3 years' time at 30, 33%, even maybe more in investments, I think it's important to understand that that's what lays the foundation for the future defense capabilities, not only of Norway, but for NATO. So one should not be one-sided on looking only at the 2% target, as Doug says, but also at the 20% target, because it points to the future and the abilities in the future as well.
Yeah, the key here is not just how much you spend, but how well do you spend it. And I think Norway's track record here is quite strong.
Let's then turn towards the rest of Europe, however. As the minister said, European defense budgets were, been struggling, and they're kind of rebounding, but still it's a far way to go. And you talked about Plan B. Doug said that's not very realistic, but nonetheless, there is a kind of a hedging. We need to, do our homework better, but it's so far to go. Look at Germany, for instance, hardly operational, struggling on so many fronts. So I mean, and even if let's agree that if it was like a miracle, political miracle was to happen, and all Europe came together and said let's agree on one tank model and one plane and what have you. Even then, we take 30 years before we get it, right? So question is, I mean, what's the European option? Is there anything at all?
Well, I mean, I think for now the European option is to simply take the Bern Sharing debate seriously. That's the first step to take, and I don't think it's taken everywhere throughout Europe, because Trump in a way is a very specific problem, because he, I mean in many ways, but in this respect, because he allows politicians, for instance in Germany, to actually position themselves against a rise in defense budget because it comes from Trump. And of course the leadership is very quick at not saying that Trump didn't invent burden sharing debates at all. So and this really is something where I guess more European leadership is needed in terms of more pressure on, for instance, Germany, because I think that's the elephant in the room here, more pressure on Germany also from other countries in Europe to actually step up, and not only France, because the direction France wants to take is the direction Germany does not want to take. So pressure from France somewhat in the German context also has a tendency to be counterproductive, as we currently see with the European Intervention Initiative.
It's also some kind of a, when Europe now starts getting together on PESCO and these things, there's also some kind of a response from US, negative response, because they feel that the American industry is kind of pushed out of Europe. So actually, when Europe starts to get act together, you kind of push in the United States, get a new conflict.
Well, in a way, I think this is first of all overstated, because if you look at the European Defence Fund, I mean, it's not so much money after all, and I don't think that the European Defence Fund will ever alter the political dimension between armament purchases throughout Europe. I mean, you don't buy European products because they're European, but you buy American because they're American. And I don't really see the EDF changing that. Secondly, looking at PESCO and all these things more broadly, well, they are at least declared to be a step towards strategic autonomy for Europe, but I mean, strategic autonomy is not strategic independence. And of course, this is a way some read it in Washington. This is also a way some read it in, I don't know, Warsaw, for instance. But this is a misreading. Now you can wonder whether it's badly communicated or whether it's just a misreading because some want to misread it. But this would be part of connecting all these efforts into one larger framework. That makes sense, and I think there is a lot of thinking, but also talking and explaining to do on that.
All right, thank you. Now, I will collect, we have 10 minutes left. I will collect 3 or 4 questions, and then we will answer them. So, gentleman in the front here, and I see some other hands. So, you start first. Please introduce yourself and be brief, please. A question, because then we get more questions.
I'll try. Thank you very much. My name is Pervis Solgi Kasai. I am the Central Board member of the Norwegian Labour Party International Forum, and also member of the Forsvarsforening. I was a diplomat before, many years ago, career diplomat. I defected my embassy from the Iranian embassy here in Norway, and I'm happy that I'm a Norwegian citizen. I wanted to tell you about first the values that our distinguished minister said. Yes, I agree. The only bastion to protect our values is NATO, given the fact that UN Security Council no, it is a lame duck. It does nothing. It's paralyzed. So I agree. And then I come to my questions quickly. The first thing is about the expansion of NATO. So I was very happy that, for example, Montenegro and all they are coming. But I'm hearing now about Colombia. And very sadly, I heard that also Qatar wanted to be the member, given the fact that Qatar had an alliance underground with the Iranian regime, wants to disturb the alliance. How is that the future? And the last question is about terrorism. You know that we have faced in our history 3 isms which wanted to destroy Nazism, Stalinism, communism, and Islamism. My question is that, given the fact that I was a diplomat in Iran, and I joined the revolution which went this way, that Khomeini was the founder of Islamic terrorism. We didn't have Islamic terrorism before '79. We had only Baader-Meinhof, Action Directe, and Red Army. That Khomeini started this. Okay, and then the ISIS is the offspring of it. Why we don't mention the threat of the Iranian regime as international terrorism? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. Just push a little bit because I would like to do a hand over there somewhere. Yes, you, sir, and you, sir. I'll take the 2 of you. The guy in the red T-shirt, yes.
Good morning. My name is Vincent Baugh. I am the Republicans Abroad Norway Vice Chair. I have a question. Given the insecurity and the instability of the EU itself, how is the American taxpayer served, or what is the advantages of the fact that it's going to take 6-10 years before we see some value for our buck that we spend here in Europe? I believe that's the case that the president is making sure that you come up to those 2%. And of course, it's not going to magically happen overnight. But so far, I've heard a whole lot of, I won't say excuses, but I've heard a whole lot of reasoning as to why we haven't there. And then I haven't really heard a timeline as to when we might get there. Do you have any comment to that?
Good question. And it was like the next 2 steps a little bit there. Yeah. And then we'll draw the line.
Good morning. My name is Dag Kloster. I could be termed as an old Russia hand, and I'm interested in Norwegian NATO relations, of course. But now my question is to the cohesion in the alliance. We see that countries, Turkey might be named as one, developing a national stance in pursuing their national interests that does not really resonate very good with the alliance solidarity that was so well explained by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Could you elaborate on these issues, please?
Thank you. So we have a question on enlargement, on Iran, on the 2% reasoning, and on values. You are free to pick as you wish, and we have like 4 minutes or something. So until you have to go, Minister, so I could stay another hour. So I suggest we do that in the same order as we started. So we start with you, and then Frank, and then Doug, and then.
Okay, so I'll just look into a couple of these issues because I don't think I will have time to do more.
No need. Take
no. But talking about expansion of NATO is, of course, something that is more or less consistently on the agenda of NATO, and I think that the principle that we've always had, the fact that countries are, of course, allowed to choose their own security policy affiliation, and no other country has a right to veto what you would like to do, what kind of organization you would like to belong to. I think that's important to underline in the future as well, because there will always be countries who would like to see NATO not expanded, or maybe even reversed in some cases, because of what they consider to be their so-called spheres of interests. And I don't think there is any chance right now that Qatar or Colombia will be NATO members. But of course, the interesting developments in the name discussion between Greece and Macedonia is, of course, something that will be put on the agenda again quite soon, I suspect. When it comes to Iran, I think all of us who have been very critical towards the American pullout of the JCPOA, we have also said that, of course, the Iran deal is not perfect. It has a lot of things that it doesn't relate to, but that's not the point with the agreement. The point is that it should prohibit Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And so far, it has succeeded in that respect. And again, there are a lot of other issues that are problematic with Iran and that needs to be addressed. But I think that it's possible to do both. It's possible to continue in the JCPOA and then start discussing the other issues that needs to be dealt with when it comes to, for instance, Iran's regional role. When it comes to the question Vincent asks about the 2% target, I will, of course, leave up to Frank to talk more about it. But I think that the question, as you raise it, it also underlines some of the things that are a bit challenging in a European context, because this is not a zero-sum game. This is not transactional. Just as I mentioned, we are investing in each other's security, and our investments, even though we do not reach the 2% target now, we're at 1.62, is not less. We won't do less in defending our European or American allies. And I think we need to come back to the idea that this is something we do by taking on an obligation obligations that are bigger than just our own national security. And if the right target is 2% or more or less, I mean, some years ago it was 3%. That is not actually the question. The question is what we're interested and willing to do to invest in our security, in European security, in American security. And when you look at, for instance, how European countries participate in operations, for instance, that's also something that I think we need to discuss. And as I always say, I mean, we've been standing shoulder by shoulder with European allies and Americans in Afghanistan now for 17 years. Afghanistan is actually the one single time Article 5 has been invoked in NATO. The one time. And I think it shows the alliance solidarity in a good way. And we will all strive to reach the 2% target and continue to invest. But that's not all.
Okay, Frank, you can shoot and pick questions.
Yeah, I'll just be brief on the 2%. I think it's important to discuss it. We should take it seriously, and it's important to show that we have a plan. What's important for us is what comes out of the investments. And to show that this work gives us the ability to fulfill the whole pledge, which is both investments and modernizing the troops, operations, and spending.
So maybe, Doug, we could take that question of values. That would be.
Yeah, let me just quickly
question.
comment on enlargement. So the treaty is actually quite clear on this. There are 3 criteria for enlargement in NATO. It says any European nation, so Qatar and Colombia are sort of off the map in that regard, who agree to the values, right, can contribute to the collective defense, and the decision must be taken by consensus among current members. So the vote today has got to be 29-0. Right? So I might have added to my potential, targets against solidarity, an enlargement debate right now, because I don't believe it'll be easy to get a vote of 29-0 on any NATO enlargement decision. But actually, the treaty here is quite clear with regard to value. So what's in this for the United States? Why is it that the United States should continue to invest as it has over the years? I mean, this is more than 2%, right? It is, first of all, Europe that is approaching whole, free, and at peace is America's largest trading partner. Together, the United States and Europe are more than 50% of all the world's economic potential. So having as your largest trading partner like-minded, friendly countries that are bound together in an alliance is fundamentally good business for America, and we shouldn't undervalue that. The second, though, is this question that the Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned with regard to NATO being not only a military alliance, but a political alliance. If you face a political challenge today, if you're an American and you face a political challenge today, anywhere in the world, if NATO is solid, if NATO is cohesive, you start facing that political challenge with 28 teammates. That's a very strong position that no potential opponent in the world has. So we start with a team of 29. I wouldn't trade that for anything. That is hugely valuable in geostrategic terms. Russia doesn't have that advantage. China will never have that advantage. So we shouldn't take this lightly. And so it is about, you know, well-off, strong European economies doing more. It is about that, right? But it's also about Americans appreciating the underlying value of the alliance, which goes well beyond 2%.
Thank you. So, Barbara, last but not least, any questions you would like to?
Well, I mean, maybe again
respond
some overarching final comments here. I think, well, talking about alliance cohesion, I think what we really need to do in Europe is to acknowledge that there is systemic change underway in the international system, in our strategic environment, and perhaps also in the transatlantic relationship. And I think it's really key to look past Trump. I mean, Trump is just one small element in all of that, but it's not the major factor. And that's what we need to take into account, and this is where we need leadership in terms of thinking about the future. And this leadership must come from various different ends. So it's not only to wait for, I don't know, a Franco-German tandem, but there's really a need of leadership coming from various parts of Europe.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry we only had 1 hour. We already spent, 5 extra hours. There's several hands that didn't get to a chance. But anyway, thank you so much for everybody who came. And let's all give an applause to the panel.